plenty to talk about. So I'd like to begin here by welcoming you all to the Ned Newman Memorial Plenary, where our topic is African cultural heritage in museums, circulation, display, return, and restitution. I'm John Monroe. I'm emceeing here. So I'll introduce the speakers as they appear. So our first is Gaëlle Beaujean. She's Curator for African Collections at the Musée du quai Branly-Jacques Chirac and lecturer in African art history at the École du Louvre. She has a doctorate in social anthropology from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, which she earned with a thesis on the royal art of the Kingdom of Abomey. That thesis provided the seed for an important monograph published in 2019, which, by the way, I highly recommend. It's L'Art de Cour d'Abomey, Le Sens des Objets, which was a winner of the Arts Council of the African Studies Association's 2021 Arnold Rubin Publication Award. Dr. Beaujean has been a key participant in the ongoing work of reassessment that has followed President Emmanuel Macron's famous 2017 Ouagadougou speech about the return of African cultural heritage, and she will be speaking to us now.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon. First, I'd like to thank the organizers for their invitation, and in particular J.P. Dalton and Naomi Andrews. I'm sorry for my French accent. And I would like to thank my two colleagues, Natasha Becker and John Monroe, for this moment of discussion with you all. The title of our panel is African Cultural Property in Museums, Circulations, Return, Display and Restitution. And the association that has brought us together today is interested in French history. So I propose to begin by presenting some French historical events related to our central theme of the restitution of African heritage. I will start with the laws, the history of the French Heritage Code, in few words, as it stands today and its origins. The national heritage, both immovable and movable, is inalienable and prescriptible and has its origin in the rules that govern property belonging to the public domain. This rule dates to the Ancien Régime, to the royal domain, the predecessor of the public domain. It was regulated by the Edit de Moulins, signed in 1566 by King Charles IX. This edict made it possible to distinguish what came under the domain of the whole territory and was as such transmitted from generation to generation as common property and not of the king and his descendants. After a brief interruption in this principle following the Révolution Française, it was re-established. It is now enshrined in the French Heritage Code, which applies to all movable property in the collection of French museum, national, territorial, regional, or municipal. Inalienability means that property in the national domain cannot be sold or returned, regardless of the circumstances in which it was acquired, which is why it is referred to as imprescriptible. It is therefore with this heritage and these laws that the discussion of restitution arises. It has been partially settled since last year for property acquired between 1933 and 1945 that was part of the spoliation of Jewish property. Also last year, a special law was passed by Parliament and then implemented by the government concerning the restitution of human remains to the requesting countries and preserved in museums. It took decades of debate, not only in the field of research, but also in politics. Museums, considered as operators, have an absolute obligation to reserve their position in these debates. In other words, they are not proactive, but they also have a duty to conduct research into the arrival of their collections. I'm going back a few years to 28 November 2017, when President Macron gave a speech at the University of Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso that raised the issue of the need to facilitate the circulation loans of varying lengths, deposits and restitution of African heritage conserved in France to Africa. This speech resulted in 2 reports commissioned by the President of the Republic with very different conclusions. One written by researchers Féoline Sarr and Bénédicte Savoie, and the other by the former President of the Louvre, Jean-Luc Martinez. In any case, both raise between the lines the question of the universality of museums, inheritors in their current form to an island approach to the world. The Sarr-Savoie report stands out for its decolonial approach. This brings me to another aspect of French history, which, for people born after 1960s, has remained well hidden and taboo. Last year, we were also expecting a 3rd law of the condition for the restitution of African property to its countries of origin, but this law is not yet ready. So I'm going to look at 2 very specific examples that place objects no longer as testimony to cultures, as has often been the case in our museum, but as testimony to French colonial history. The first focus will focus on the 2021 restitution in connection with the colonial war in Abomey, the former capital of a West African kingdom, which was the subject of my PhD in 2015. And the second on the practice of collecting in a colonial context during a French ethnographic expedition, which is the subject of a collaborative exhibition I am coordinating and which will open at the Musée du quai Branly next April. So Abomey. I don't know, yes, no, it doesn't work. Yes, here. Abomey and Ouida was the 2 turn. Abomey was the capital of a kingdom, the kingdom of Dahomey, created by King Rouet-Badja at the end of the 17th century, with expansionist aims enshrined in its constitution. Very well organized militarily, Dahomey incorporated a female army from the reign of Hongbe, the only queen. Her successor, King Agadja, with his large and powerful mixed army, managed to conquer strategic towns, including the harbor of Ouida in 1727, where Europeans, including the French, had been organizing the slave trade to America since the 16th century. A few years later, the kingdom sold its prisoners and slaves, often captured during their territorial expansion, directly to the Europeans. Through these sales, Dahomey came to dominate the entire region, both economically and militarily, with firearms acquired through trade with Europe. So some picture of the dynasty of the kings and some pictures, some engravings of this at this moment. excuse me, relations change in the wake of the abolition of the slave trade, first in Great Britain, then followed by France. Also, treaties were proposed and signed to change the economic system based almost exclusively on agriculture and palm oil in particular. Dahomey nevertheless continues the clandestine slave trade to Brazil under the reign of King Gezo and Gaëlle. We are in 19th century, and from the second half of this century, Western Europeans' desire to colonize the African continent was confirmed. Several representatives of the head of states of European countries, as well as a representative of the Ottoman Empire and the United States, met in Berlin at the end of the 1884, beginning of 1885, to draw up multilateral treaties setting out the rules for trade and future treaties for the division of the African continent between certain European powers that would automatically develop an empire. The British, the Germans, the Portuguese, the Italians, the Spanish, the King of Belgium, because the Congo would be his private property until 1908, and the French. The fight against the slave trade became central to the justification for colonization. France already, not yet. France already had a foothold in what was to become colonial Dahomey. France placed the town of Porto Novo under its protectorate to combat Abomé's attempted attacks on the town it was trying to conquer. In February 1890, the French took direct action against Dahomey for the first time in the village of Cotonou, which had been annexed by the French. Our collection bears witness to this. This is the inventory of Musée d'ethnographie du Trocadéro with the donation of some objects took on the soldiers, men and women. This confrontation resumed in 1892, but this time with a large contingent sent from Paris and led by Lieutenant Colonel Dodds. The territory was colonized in 2 stages, from August to December 1892, then from April 1893 to January 1894. The first French offensive against Dahomey and its capital Dahomey lasted 4 months. It culminated in the capture of Abomey on 17 November 1892, when the king, his army and his staff fled the town to organize a mobile resistance, territorially speaking. The French press widely reported this colonization, as you see on the slides, but was more discreet about the donation to the Musée d'ethnographie du Trocadéro of a few royal objects taken from Abomey by Dodds, who had meanwhile become a general. In reality, he gave a series of objects in 2 stages, part on his return in early 1893, and the second part after the capture of King Béanzin in January 1894. In all, 27 objects were donated to the Musée du Trocadéro, whose collection were later transferred to the Musée de l'Homme and after the Musée du Quai Branly. No information accompanied what the museum described as a donation. At the end of the 19th century, the museography of the regalia, like that, glorified the taking of war by placing the royal figure, the Beaujean, as you see, on podiums. A glorification of colonization immediately interpreted in this way by visitors. Over time, the meaning of this object changed with the advance of French ethnology and the creation of the Musée de l'Homme in 1937 on the eve of the World War II. The discourse was transformed and the objects became witnesses to cultures and the expression of culture called an ethnic group. Colonial history took a back seat, disappearing completely after the war. The debate surrounding a collection of African objects, items, works crystallized around the opposition between the ethnographic approach and the aesthetic approach with the creation of the Musée du quai Branly, which, if you are familiar with it, highlights the genius of even anonymous artists. So some presentation and one, but it's another case for the Vaudou dedicated to Gou, and now to the Musée du Louvre. And on your right, the presentation of two boat show when we opened the museum in 2006. However, next to two of the royal statue of Abomey, initially exhibited in a space that was too narrow, as you see, and therefore close to the boat show, a video explains the arrival of this object after the colonial war. This was perhaps the only place on the permanent tower where the colonial question and the collections were directly evoked. In 2012, as you see, a larger area with more objects from the spoils of war was dedicated to Abomey, along with many historical elements from the kingdom, history of the slave trade, and history of the colonization, and an additional video. However, the colonial question was not really raised, and some associations began to call for the object to be returned in 2014. For my part, I completed and defended my dissertation in 2015, which looked at a much broader corpus of Abomey court art between Benin and the rest of the world, seeking to understand the trajectories, biographies, and discourses of these objects. I would like to say a few words about part of this corpus, which come from war booty. The number of objects from this booty is difficult to assess, and I am still discovering more. Officers and non-commissioned officers remained very discreet. It was necessary to consult military marching diaries, private or public archives of members of the colonial army, and sometimes of publications, in order to reconstruct what they found. And it was also necessary to look at auctions that mentioned the provenance of the spoils of war as a valuable pedigree until 2017. So, in 2015, the King of Abomey asked the President of Republic of Benin, Patrice Talon, to take action to demand the return of the spoils of war to the French. A few months later, the Beninese government asked the French government to return the booty, but the French government refused in the name of the Heritage Code and the principle of inalienability. Then came a change of president in France, and in the months following his investiture, Emmanuel Macron became involved in the issue, as he would do with other memorial issues relating to French colonial history throughout the African continent. So, a total of 26 artifacts were selected from the booty. I don't know by whom. Really, it's true. Object seized by General Dodds, who led the troops. The issue became political. A decree law was proposed by the government and debated for many months in special committees of the Assemblée nationale and the Senate. The decree was promulgated on 24 December 2020, and the objects were returned to Benin. The truck arrived in Cotonou at La Marina, it's the presidential palace, and some picture of the exhibition in Cotonou in February 2022. So some voices were raised on the French side, particularly concerning the legality of war booty at the time. It was in fact prohibited for around 10 years after the capture of Abomey and was enshrined in the international law of war. It's a law of l'AE. But this debate about the restitution or circulation of this heritage is not just about a conflict, but about a historical event that until now has been hidden from the education of the general public in France, colonization. While some people talk about decolonizing the museum, I would prefer to use the terms making the colonial visible, as a complement to other approaches, of course. So we need to talk. So we need to look at how this object passed from Africa to French hands. This is a complex exercise. It requires a combination of analysis. Firstly, we need to look at the first French owner in terms of his or her background, biography, role on the African continent, ties, and any memory he or she may have left behind. Then, we look at the context of the territory at the time of what some call the collection, and finally at what the archives have to say. Since 2020, Musée du Quai Branly, and like many other French museums, has had a new type of documentalist working on collection, particularly African collections at the time of colonization. The curators are also taking this approach, so I'm going to talk the last example. So it's a new publication about the 15 colonial thefts at Pluto Book, if you are interested. And and my second example, that of the Dakar-Djibouti ethnographic expedition in the colonial context. I'm coordinating a research project and an exhibition with a team of researchers from several African countries where the collection originated, and French researchers who know the expedition and its extensive archives inside it, some of them for more than 30 years. In France, then, the Dakar-Djibouti expedition is regarded as an emblematic mission linked to the birth of the French ethnology and to the revival of the Musée d'ethnographie du Trocadéro, the future Musée de l'Homme, which was undergoing major reform. Expedition was multidisciplinary with 4 permanent members, including Marcel Griol, who headed it, and seven temporary members. It also made a major contribution to the creation of disciplines such as ethnomusicology and ethnobotany a few years later. One of the permanent members, so just for the object, but it's, yeah, and archives, okay. One of the permanent members, Michel Léris, also kept a diary which he published a year after his return entitled Fantôme Africa, l'Afrique fantôme en français. He gives an unfiltered account of the colonial reality from which they benefited in order to achieve their objectives in the service of science and museums. The expedition crossed the continent from west to east in just under 2 years, from 1931 to 1933 in a colonial context. All the countries crossed were under French, British, Belgian or Italian colonial rule, except for Ethiopia, which was independent. More than 3,500 objects make up this collection, half of which come from present-day Mali. This country was under French rule and administered by the French, who introduced the Code de l'Indigénat, forced labor for infrastructure and the capitation tax. While the initial intention of the expedition was to collect objects from the daily life of society that was supposed to be disappearing, and they did this in large numbers, they also chose sacred objects linked either to Mal-Initiation Society or to Christian churches in Ethiopia, as well as personal objects passed down from generation to generation in short family legacies. They also accepted a number of donations from colonial staff on duty, some of which were seized by the colonial court and other possibly taken in war. Here, too, we had to turn to archives that helped us to situate the political context of these territories through which the ethnologists traveled, and to link the nature of the object with colonial conflicts shortly before their arrival. For half of the objects, we have no information on how they were acquired. For the other half, however, we have identified a spectrum ranging from purchase at the market to theft via exchange or commission. To return to our subject of restitution, the results are being closely scrutinized. We carry out a full inventory of the provenance of each country with colleagues from Senegal, Mali, Burkina Faso, Benin, Chad, Cameroon, Ethiopia, and Djibouti, representing over 80% of the collection. There are suspicions of fraudulent purchases in territories formerly colonized by France, but outright thefts have also been identified, particularly in Mali. Particularly in Mali, which has requested restitution following these studies. Here is well known and damning example for the expedition, that of the Boli from the Kono sanctuary in Mali. The Kono is a male society of highly initiated men whose activities, powers and knowledge are forbidden to the uninitiated. At Diabougou, at Diabougou, the authority of the expedition is signaled by the color of their skin and the French occupiers' flag on the bonnet of the corps, giving them the power to go beyond the ban a second time and seize sacred objects. Léris wrote on 7 September 1931. citation. Before leaving Diabougou, I visited the village and abducted a second Kono whom Gaëlle has spotted by surreptitiously breaking into the reserved hut. This time, Lieutenant and I take charge of the operation. My heart is beating fast because, since yesterday's scandal, I am more acutely aware of the enormity of what we are doing. Using his hunting knife, Lieutenant removes the mask from the feathered suit to which it is attached, hands it to me so that I can wrap it in the clothes we've brought, and also gives me, at my request, because it's one of the strange shapes that had intrigued us so much yesterday, a kind of suckling pig, still made of brown nougat, in other hand coagulate blood, weighing at least 15 kilos, which I wrap up with the mask. Everything is quickly taken out of the village and we return to the cars through the field. When we left, the chief wanted to give Lieutenant back the 20 francs we had given him. Lieutenant let him have it, naturally, but it doesn't make it any less ugly. So the African collection was also made of thefts, and according to the French Heritage Code, no collection can be returned, regardless of the circumstances of its initial acquisition. So here, behind the scenes at a museum that holds some 75,000 objects from sub-Saharan Africa, is an example of an investigation. This study was initially intended for circulation. We hope that the Paris exhibition will provide an opportunity to convince sponsors and institutions to pay for the transport and the museography as requested by the countries concerned. There is also talk of requests for restitutions already having been made in the case of Mali. The country has requested the totality of the Malian collections acquired during the colonial period. But this research, carried out jointly has made it possible to identify objects that were willingly handed over, as well as others that require further research in the field. Conclusion. The question of the restitution of African cultural property raises an unprecedented intelligible aspect. This immateriality is the French colonial history. From conflicts with their war booty to the sometimes violent acquisition opportunities facilitated by colonial authority. This debate should not, however, obscure the force that African art has injected into Western art, right down to its roots in the history of French art. Today, our museums are increasingly turning their attention to modern and contemporary African forms, which until recently were considered to have been altered by globalization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Natasha Becker. She's curator of African art at the Beaujean Museum here in San Francisco. When she was appointed in 2020, she was both the museum's first specialist curator of African art and the museum's first Black curator. She was born in Cape Town, in apartheid South Africa, and received an MA in African history from the University of the Western Cape before coming to the United States to do graduate work at Musée. From there, she went on As a curator, she specializes in contemporary art, a domain in which she has organized numerous exhibitions in prestigious international venues ranging from Johannesburg to Hong Kong to New York to here. It's all yours, Natasha.
It's okay. Oh, allez, go.
So do you have that? I think you need this gizmo.
No. Oh, ah, si, yes.
Yes, I think that's it. That is put that in there. It should work.
Okay.
Because that will work.
Okay. Sorry, I don't wear bifocals, so when I look at you, I can't see you. But I can see my paper, and if I put my glasses on, I can't see my paper, but I can see you. So, thank you, and good afternoon. Thank you, John, for moderating today, and thank you for the invitation from the Society. It's my pleasure to be here and to speak to you today about the present. Today I'm going to talk about obviously revisiting cultural property and specifically the Benin bronzes and restitution, as well as the contemporary responses. And apologies if I'm sort of summarizing a bit of the history that you are all familiar with already. But this history of cultural property in museums is, of course, deeply intertwined with colonial violence and the circulation of objects across borders and the ongoing struggle for restitution. And as we explore these themes today, I want to juxtapose two distinct but connected narratives: the historical legacy of the Benin bronzes and a contemporary artistic response by Yinka Shonibari, the Nigerian-British artist, that proposes a creative and forward-thinking approach to the same issues. So the first part, I'll talk about the Benin bronzes and this history of displacement. The Benin bronzes, which is, the general term for a group of sculptures that were created by the Edo people of the Benin Kingdom in modern-day Nigeria. And these are among the most well-known examples of African art looted during the colonial era by the British Empire. These works are intricately crafted and made of, brass plaques, royal regalia, they are commemorative heads, and they were made primarily from the 16th century onwards. Although we say Benin bronzes, the royal art of the court of Benin actually included, works in wood, in ivory, and so forth. But the Benin plaques especially embodied this rich history of the Benin Kingdom and offered glimpses into the social, political, and spiritual life of a sophisticated civilization. Commissioned for ancestral altars and used in royal rituals, these objects were essential to the identity and power of the monarchy in Benin. In 1897, British royal forces invaded Benin, looting the royal palace and removing an estimated 3,000 works, many of which ended up in collections across Europe and the United States much later. The violence of the invasion and the subsequent dispersal of these artworks represented a profound loss, severing the artworks from their cultural and historical context. And institutions like the British Museum, as well as those in Germany, France, and the United States, have long been home to these objects and fueling this global debate over their rightful ownership and the ethical implications of their continued display. Most American museums, will have their
collections policies on their websites, and all of these include actually not collecting looted art. That seems to apply to most everything, but African art, and so it was very important. This last few years have been very important in actually making that case, irrefutable, that the bronzes do belong to that group of looted artworks. So in recent years, these efforts to return have gained momentum. The Nigerian government, the current Oba Iwari II, and international groups such as the Benin Dialogue, the International Council of Museums, have called for the restitution of these bronzes. And notable returns have already occurred, with museums in the UK and the United States beginning to repatriate pieces, and in France as well. Maybe not the Benin bronzes, but and this year in 2024, the Smithsonian, made news because the Smithsonian Institution returned 29 Benin bronzes in what was, took a couple of years, the process of initiating that return, and as well as arranging a long-term loan agreement with the Oba, the current Oba, so that some works will remain at the Smithsonian on loan. The legal transfer of property took place, but the Oba agreed to a long-term loan at the institution at the Smithsonian. And these actions generally underscored a lot of these broader issues surrounding colonial era looting, and highlighted this need for equitable restitution of cultural property, and of course the participation of the Oba of Benin in these discussions and processes. And you are looking, what you see on in the slides is the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco's Benin bronzes. We have 4 Benin works in the Benin Royal Court style: a bronze plaque, a bronze hip ornament, a wooden stool, and a wooden sculpture of an Oba's head. And these works were either purchased from art galleries or gifted to the museum. And in fact, James Willis was a so-called tribal art dealer in San Francisco, and these works were, the bronzes, not the wooden objects, were acquired by the museums from the gallery, and the gallerist acquired the plaque from a Sotheby's auction. So, given the colonial provenance, we are actively working towards deaccessioning these objects and aligning it with these broader commitments to, honor the rights of Benin communities and cultural heritage. And I will say that, when I first arrived at the museums, the plaque, the hip ornament and the stool were on display, and it was really at the top of our list of priorities that I would address that, in the last 3 years since I've been there. And one of the first things that I did was, to add a QR code to the display so that we could actually link to a larger, page on the website that really, as you were saying, makes visible this history. And then, at another stage, I gave 2 informational presentations to our acquisitions committee, because that's the committee that would really, facilitate deaccessioning with the director's approval. And so there was also, presentations that I made to the general all staff, so that people are internally educated, and that the steps were very clear that we were taking. And then a year later, I removed the Benin bronzes from display, and this was also part of some dialogues with students who were coming to the museum. Actually, some Stanford students. I worked with Joelle Cabrita at the African Studies on a kind of provenance class, private and public, between students coming to the De Young Museum and also going to a private collection in close to Stanford. So we took the bronzes off display and, as I said, continued this internal process of advocating for their deaccessioning, which is a two-step process at the museum where you present to the committee, and in that two-step process there's 6 months in between in which we really go a little deeper and gather all the research that we need and the contacts, and also consult all the guidelines that are available to us to determine that final step. And only after that will an actual dialogue be initiated with authorities in Nigeria, for instance. So the process internally has sort of taken its own course. We cannot return an object unless there is a partner who will accept that and work with us to do that. So obviously there's a larger context for this as well, although since the 50s and 60s, West African countries in particular have been very vocal about repatriation and return. It was really, I think, the Savoy report that was a flashpoint and a catalyst, and that really came from the French President Macron, and that provided a significant framework for restitution of African cultural property, but I think also more importantly concluded that the loss of cultural property is actually a traumatic experience and has deeper implications than simply a conversation about objects, but really a conversation about the psyche of a nation and the cultural wounding that took place. Something we did as well was to join the Digital Benin project, which many of you might know about, and this is a collaborative international effort that includes the Royal Court of Benin, the Nigerian government, European and American institutions, and this project aims to create a comprehensive digital archive of all Benin bronzes held worldwide. It's an amazing project with a long-term goal of being able to facilitate the research that we need to do and the process we need to engage in to present these artworks and to support their returns. And so as part of this, we've made the objects in the collection accessible, and this is a sort of screenshot from Digital Benin to give you a sense of the kinds of information that it provides. There's actually another page further down, so it shows provenance, it shows notes, additional notes, exhibition history, publication history, and so forth. And this research is ongoing as well. And so we also have, as part of the museum's approach and process, made provenance and repatriation transparent on our website. Right now, the big emphasis is on NAGPRA, which is the Native American remains and returns process, and that has really taken priority because of the museum's, his Northern Californian history and the remains that are in the museum's collections, which far exceed the number of Benin bronzes that the museum has. So so as I said, we are in this first phase of deaccessioning, and there are still several months to go before the bronzes are formally deaccessioned in line with established guidelines from the Association of Art Museum Directors. And that framework takes into account provenance, legal considerations, ethical standards, and compliance with relevant laws both in Africa as well as in the United States. And the approach is also informed by a CASA, which John can speak to, the collaborations, collection and restitution best practices document, which is available online as well. I think it's over 80 pages, but is incredibly informative and rich. And the Arts Council of the African Studies Association, ACASA, developed these best practices in collaboration with Africa-based institutions, professionals, and community members. And they really provide guidance to us on ethical engagements with communities whose cultural heritage is represented in our collections, ensuring that museums do uphold some general standards of respect and responsibility in their work with African objects. And so in future we do intend to initiate this open dialogue with all stakeholders in relation to the four works currently in our collection, but soon to be deaccession. And the possibilities are not clear, but I can say that the museum's leadership and the director is 100% committed to the process. So there's no, obstacles in that sense, and open to that conversation as well. In part 2 of this talk, I want to speak a little bit to reclaiming the narrative and to Yinka Shonibari's Monument to the Restitution of the Mind and Soul, recent 2024 installation that he created for the Nigeria Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, which is still up if any of you are near Venice anytime soon. I think it closes at the end of this month or maybe early December. So while the restitution of looted artifacts is a crucial step in acknowledging historical wrongs, contemporary artists are also offering new ways of reimagining these histories. British-Nigerian artist Yinka Shonibari Monument is an urgent and innovative response to this legacy of the Benin expedition in 1897. Created for the Nigeria Pavilion, he draws attention to the cultural theft of Benin art while also proposing a new framework for that restitution can also take. In this monumental work, Shonibari recreated approximately 20% of the bronzes that are currently housed in the British Museum, using clay that mirrors the original Benin bronze color and texture. Displayed in a manner that recalls the object's original placement in royal shrines, these recreated works are returned to a more organic spiritual context, one that has been denied to them in the sterile confines of museums. By doing so, Shonibari reestablishes their cultural vitality, offering a visual and symbolic restitution that goes beyond physical return. What sets Shonibari's work apart is its engagement with both history and contemporary identity. Embedded in the piece is the bust of Sir Harry Rawson, the British officer responsible for leading the invasion of Benin. This bust is adorned with the Dutch wax printed fabric for which Shonibari is known, a symbol of the colonial exchange that has shaped modern African identity. The work challenges the power dynamics between European museums and the African cultures they have historically represented, creating space for a new dialogue about cultural sovereignty, restitution, and the complex legacies of colonialism. So to connect the past and the present in this moment, on the one hand deaccessioning the Benin bronzes, and on the other hand integrating Shonibari's monument into the collection as part of our long-term display, I think is a unique and creative approach to these ongoing discussions where the past and the present can both exist together. And we are engaged in the ways in which contemporary art can reveal and reflect both the wounds but also the possibilities. So, I think that many museums have modeled and sought this arrangement where, legal property is transferred, at least in the United States, and, where there are larger numbers of works that, there could be some kind of arrangement. And that isn't actually unique to this particular case. There are other such arrangements with Mesoamerica, for instance, Peru or Mexico, that have also sort of bridged this, this divide. So Shonibari's monument will serve as this pivotal piece in an upcoming exhibition of the artist's work at the Legion of Honor. And beyond that exhibition, this installation, which was acquired by the museum in September this year, will be on long-term display in the Arts of Africa galleries, where we will work on establishing an interpretive framework that does include, many perspectives and voices, those of the current Obo of Benin scholars, artists, among others, to ensure that the work is represented with respect and with honesty. So monument, in the context of a museum, I think challenges our visitors to reflect on the legacy and also encourages a deeper understanding of African art as a living and dynamic force, one that continues to evolve and inform global conversations about history, identity, culture, and power. And it's our hope that monument will act as both a symbol of historical restitution and a catalyst for ongoing conversations about justice, representation, and cultural memory. And through this intersection of historical restitution and contemporary art practice, we seek to offer and think about new models for engaging with African cultural property, one that is grounded in respect, in creativity, and an understanding of the ongoing impacts of colonial violence and colonialism. So as we move towards more equitable future work, artists such as this and artworks like the bronzes and the contemporary work create a crucial space for dialogue and reflection and education, which is a very important part of the mission of the museum as well, ensuring that both the cultural heritage of Benin and of Africa more broadly can be acknowledged as well as celebrated. Thank you. That's the last one.
All right. Well, right. So in responding to these fascinating talks, I think really the place to start is with a feeling of what you might call world historical wonder. When I started my own research on the French reception of historical African art back in the mid-2000s, I never would have in my wildest dreams, and I mean ever, imagined there would come a time when the French state would actually return works of African art acquired during the colonial period, right? I mean, I'm just thinking of the splendor of La Loi with a capital LL, of the whole concept of imprescriptibility, which is like a kind of nation-state power flex. They set that aside, blindness in the face of the colonial past seemed as if it would be a permanent condition. I remember, for instance, Nicolas Sarkozy's 2005 effort, geez, that's 20 years ago now, right, but you remember 2005 to forbid the teaching of negative views of French colonization because, and I quote, and this is still findable on Google, quote, "this permanent repentance, which means we have to apologize for France's history, borders on absurdity," unquote. That was then. And now look where we are, not only in France, but also in the US, Canada, the Netherlands, Germany, really just about any former colonial power. It's truly astounding. And at first, I'd thought that perhaps I could suggest some factors that could be considered to be causes of this change, but then I found myself, as I was doing that, falling into rabbit holes. I'm thinking, the unspoken code of the aesthetic disposition in Bourdieu's sense as a power play, the impact of the precedent of Holocaust restitutions, the museum function as an aspect of the post-colonial nation state, right? Okay, all these things. My suggestions, right, as you can see there, were both too cumbersome to elaborate concisely and woefully inefficient or insufficient, which makes sense because this isn't a question to be resolved in a single comment. It seems clear to me that we're looking at a profound bouleversement de mentalité, something in its way comparable to the intellectual cultural transformation that we see in the lead up to the French Revolution. The abrupt turn to restitution that began in the late 2010s will, I suspect, provide very rich analytical terrain for future historians. Maybe not as rich as the lead up to the Revolution, but still a far bigger chunk, a far bigger morsel than a panel response in response to two very interesting papers can begin to swallow, let alone digest. So, saying that then, for that reason, I think it's more productive to focus at this point on information gathering and really pure curiosity, which means leaving some time for our panelists to engage with one another and with questions from you. And in that spirit, then, I'll start something off, or I'll start things off, our conversation off, with a question for both Gaëlle and Natasha. It seems to me that one of the richest opportunities afforded by this new awareness of the extent to which colonial exploitation is implicated in the presence of historical African material culture in non-African museums is the chance it affords for dialogue. For various communities implicated in the history and reception of these objects to express their views and explain what repair or justice or acknowledgement looks like from where they stand. Which gets to the question, what have each of you learned from the dialogues this dramatic shift in both cultural attitudes and, to some degree, I suppose, institutional policies has provoked? And here I mean dialogues with the members of the public you serve, as well as representatives of the source communities, so both the public and source communities. Have there been positions taken that you didn't expect, or differences in points of view that have surprised you or taught you something new? There we are.
So, je peux répondre en français?
Oui, tout à fait.
Alors, je pense que la question de la réparation, puisque tu l'as abordée,
oui.
C'est une question qu'on peut se poser à travers les restitutions. Est-ce que c'est une réparation de ces drames coloniaux, du drame colonial? Je ne saurais pas répondre, mais je pense que cette question de la réparation, elle se cristallise. C'est vraiment... Je ne crois pas qu'on aborde la question coloniale en France et le repentir autrement que par ce débat des restitutions qui arrive très tardivement quand même, en 2017. Mais est-ce que c'est une réparation? Je ne suis pas sûre. Il me semble qu'à travers les acquisitions de ces objets africains, et quand je dis objet, on sait que c'est peut-être un autre mot qui conviendrait. Certaines de ces acquisitions ont bouleversé profondément les cultures, les religions auxquelles ces objets étaient rattachés. Alors dans le cas d'Abomey, au lendemain, dans les années 50, en fait, des coloniaux, des administrateurs coloniaux qui étaient sur place disaient que ces deux administrateurs disaient que c'était des pertes irréparables, y compris les objets. C'était une perte irréparable pour le politique, évidemment, mais pour la culture de la ville en général. Ensuite, la deuxième question, alors oui, il y a la question du dialogue, le dialogue entre...
entre partis à la restitution.
Entre partis et public, tout le monde autour de cette question.
Ouais.
Donc aussi, le public pas peut-être directement impliqué.
Alors, disons que ça a été un débat public, politique, mené par les leaders, en fait. Nous avons été un peu consultés mais ce n'est pas un débat des citoyens. En tout cas, c'est tellement tabou et caché, cette histoire coloniale, que, on n'en parle pas à l'école, on n'est pas éduqué pour. Dans les musées, il y a aussi un tabou autour de ça. Je suis au musée depuis 1999 et c'était uniquement autour d'Abomey qu'on a pu parler de la question coloniale. Maintenant que les objets sont restitués, nous n'avons plus d'endroit dans l'espace permanent où on parle de l'histoire coloniale, donc ça a disparu de nouveau. Donc ce n'est pas vraiment un débat public, ce n'est pas un débat de citoyens, c'est certains diraient, et c'est pour ça qu'il y a eu ces lois autour de l'inaliénabilité, l'imprescriptibilité, le code du patrimoine, c'est le fait du prince. Il y a cette histoire, en tout cas c'est perçu comme ça dans le débat public. Le président Macron veut restituer, c'est lui qui décide. Voilà comment les choses se sont... voilà comment le débat s'est... Donc le dialogue, disons que maintenant il y a une prise de conscience du public, des visiteurs. Les gens ont conscience de ce fait colonial et que les objets africains ne sont pas arrivés forcément de manière, on va dire, de manière consentie par les propriétaires initiaux, pour résumer. Voilà, et le dialogue, en fait, il est, je pense, sous une autre forme, et c'est ce que recommandait le rapport Sarr-Savoie. Il se porte vraiment en termes d'éthique professionnelle, d'éthique relationnelle. Donc c'est une question de déontologie et de modalité de travail qui est en train de changer entre les musées, tous les musées français qui ont ces collections d'objets africains, mais aussi océaniens, mais aussi américains, mais aussi asiatiques, donc extra-européens. Donc une volonté de désormais faire des expositions avec des professionnels des pays d'origine et aussi étudier ces collections sans forcément faire d'exposition, mais en tout cas faire des recherches avec des représentants des personnes qui détiennent un savoir autour de... Donc le dialogue, il est plutôt à ce niveau-là. Excuse me, Natasha, but it was just for me. I will explain to you. Ok. Bon, je vais laisser pour la deuxième question, j'interviendrai après.
Merci beaucoup.
Yeah, I think dialogue is an interesting question because it's really dialogues, and I don't think so much it's a new awareness for Africa, but I do think that it's a new awareness for Europe and for the United States, who, always see Africa or, Eastern Europe as belated, whatever sort of off-center. So I think that in terms of public intellectuals and public culture, that it has been more of a kind of, push to actually come to this new awareness, that debate in and of itself has been one of kind of activism, and many decades of struggle to arrive at that point. And the reason I say dialogues is because, from my position within the museum, I think there's internal dialogues that take place with leadership and with staff and other departments, and those internal dialogues are very much focused on the ethical dimensions of restitution and, wanting to be on the right side of history when it comes to the restitution of looted art and the Benin bronzes. And so there's a very strong, ethical conversation with internally. And I would say that so that's sort of one, like bubble or conversation, and then there's all these micro dialogues that I have, and one was with our head of conservation brought it to my attention that the conservation intern, one of the conservation interns she had one summer, who I, had asked to catalogue some ironworks, that was accession, small objects, collection of ironworks, about 100 or so, that was gifted to the museum. And this is a great intern project to do on a summer, and she didn't want to work on African objects, and she categorically did not want to work on anything that was from the African arts collection because of colonialism, and felt, that it's a colonial collection and did not want to be part of that. So, she was an intern, and so she could leave, the museum. There's just this whole range. I also had a fellow who, worked with me for almost 2 years, and chose a first-generation Yoruba Nigerian American, and who chose to work on an Egungun costume in the museum's collection, and through her research on that was able to connect with colleagues in the United States who had Egungun in their collections, Brooklyn Museum, for instance, and so on. And also went to Lagos, to Nigeria, where she'd been as a child but hadn't returned, as an adult. And that trip was, again, connecting with colleagues in Lagos who were specialists in textiles and in Egungun. And, she came back and gave a presentation to our art division, and her presentation was really about how, how before she saw it as this very black and white issue, either on one side or on the other side, but through her experience in the fellowship, the fact that she was able to, rediscover her own identity and her own, home in Nigeria again. And in fact, her mom and her dad went with her on the trip, and, it brought in a sort of third path and element for her. And she could, see the kind of, in a way, her project represented the confluence, of the two things within the institution. And, the research that she did on the Egungun was incredibly important, because even though this is behind the scenes, that research, before that research, there were no protocols for the Egungun. There was, no guidelines for how to store it, display it, etc. It had been on view when the museum had first opened, and it, hadn't been on view since. And so her work really helped us to establish those guidelines and those principles. And so when we speak about, when you ask about repair and harm, having a protocol for, and a protocol that involved a ceremony before we begin working with the Egungun, before we move it, before we take it for x-rays, before we have it photographed, that was a conversation that came out of the dialogue with, colleagues and communities in Lagos. And so that really created these protocols, like I said, within for how we respect the costume, and how, the fact that we don't know whether it's active or not means that we actually do have to take more care, with it. And honestly, it's like I could see the Egungun costume was standing up straighter, than it had been before. It was sort of schlumpy before. And that's because it had, it was treated with this respect, I think, but also given respectful conservation treatment, and, looked at models for what would be the best way to display this work so that we don't bring further harm to the fabrics, and so that was, a whole set of dialogues and conversations that happened over 2 years. And then, there are students and visitors and colleagues too that come through all the time. I recently had a visitor who lives in the Bay Area, who emailed me and said that, she was a Shango chief in the Shango religion, and she noticed that the labels on the labels, there were two Shango objects in a case, and the labels were mixed up. The one on the right should go on the left, and the one on the left should go on the right. And she sent me a picture, and it was true. And I remembered that the label had actually been, reprinted, and there was a challenge with it. And I think in all that, they got sort of put in the wrong way. But she sent, a photograph that she'd taken in the galleries, and really implored me to fix this because it was just so important to her and to Shango community. Of course, I made a request in a form, sent that, emailed that off. I followed up a couple of weeks later, got it scheduled, and I think 3 or 4 technicians later, the case was removed, the object was changed, and the label was replaced. So I could write to her and say, we've now replaced the label. I think that the dialogues are really multitude and very complex and very different depending on your position and your location. And I think it's important to have it all be together actually, rather than these sorts of big debates that end up polarizing, being very polarizing and making people feel like they have to make a choice between one or the other. And I think a big part of the dialogue in restitution that gets left out is that there are communities in America, there are communities in Africa, and how they have ideas about how they want their cultural heritage to be represented and stewarded.
Well, I will just say briefly, one of the kind of uncanny things here is
the convergence of what the two of you had to say, which I find really, so Natasha, you might, it converged in that sense of changing our perspective to value a broader range of forms of knowledge, sort of manifestations of knowledge, which is very interesting. So, if anyone has any questions, we have someone with a microphone, and there is a hand raised in the back there, so if you could.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Tabitha Ewing, and the question that I have is really to do with different conceptions of, say, nation and kingdom on the one hand, and property on the other. And I wonder how you, not in terms of reparation, which I think is a bigger and much more challenging issue and much more complex, as you've already spoken to, but just the physical restitution. Are you returning it to the kingdom? Are you returning it to the nation? If to the nation, on what grounds? And so forth, right? Thank you.
Je vais vous répondre en français. Alors, même, pour parler du royaume du Dahomey Kingdom, on a un prince qui s'appelle Maurice Aranhozo-Glele, qui est donc issu de la famille royale, qui est un grand historien béninois, qui a écrit en 1974 au sujet du royaume du Dahomey comme une nation. Pour lui, c'est une nation. Bon. Pour revenir sur la restitution, en France, les demandes de restitution se font d'État à État. Voilà pourquoi, par exemple, en 2014, je parlais de l'association du CRAN, en fait, c'est je ne sais plus l'acronyme, mais en tout cas, c'est une association qui demandait la restitution du butin de guerre d'Abomey au Bénin, non, à la famille royale. Et ils l'ont demandé au musée. Le musée du quai Branly a répondu, les demandes de restitution se font d'État à État. Donc voilà pourquoi en 2015, fin 2015, le roi d'Abomey a demandé, ou début 2016, au président de la République du Bénin, donc la nation, de faire la demande de restitution. Mais je vois où vous voulez en venir, puisqu'il y a la photo de l'exposition dans un lieu spécial. Et donc, cela s'est fait d'État à État. Au début, c'était non, et puis après, ça a été oui. Et quand on a organisé l'exposition pour dire au revoir aux objets, ça a duré une semaine, il y avait une petite photo là à côté du camion où on voyait l'exposition au quai Branly. On a eu énormément de monde et le Bénin participait. On a travaillé vraiment main dans la main pour cette exposition avec une agence qui dépend du président du Bénin. Et cette agence a demandé à ce qu'on ne mette pas en avant le trésor royal d'Abomey, mais qu'on parle du Bénin, restitution au Bénin. En sous-titre, c'était les trésors royaux d'Abomey, pour mettre en avant cette idée de nation, et donc d'une propriété qui n'est plus la famille royale, mais qui appartient, en fait, qui au final se calque sur un modèle qu'on connaît, qui est le modèle du musée, qui est un opérateur de l'État, en l'occurrence. Mais ces objets, où sont-ils aujourd'hui? Où sont-ils arrivés à la présidence du Bénin? Où ont-ils été exposés au palais présidentiel au Bénin? Et où sont-ils aujourd'hui dans des caisses au palais présidentiel du Bénin? Donc, ça appartient visiblement à la nation. Ça doit revenir à Abomey une fois que le nouveau musée sera construit, peut-être l'année prochaine ou dans 2 ans. Mais ce n'est plus, contrairement à ce qui se passe à Benin City où c'est l'OBA qui reçoit en fait les objets restitués, là en fait c'est l'État, mais parce que la France conditionne la restitution d'État à État. Après, c'est aux États qui retrouvent les objets de s'arranger avec peut-être des villes, des anciens royaumes, mais en tout cas, du côté français, on ne veut pas avoir... il y a une volonté très claire de restituer modestement. On est à 26 objets sur 75 000 objets. Donc, mais voilà. En tout cas, que ça se fasse d'État à État et non pas... et c'est aux États qui reçoivent les objets de voir avec l'économie. Merci beaucoup pour votre question.
Hi. C'est Saline Gauvin. Okay, I'll speak in English, but for the recording. Oh, okay. I'll speak into it. Okay, I'm curious if there's any question. We focus a lot on the legality of acquisition, but in the colonial context, is anything with such an economic imbalance? Is anything really, is there legality or in any of these acquisitions? And I'm curious if that prevents us from seeing sort of the contemporary implications in terms of how art now is still funded largely in the former French colonial empire by the French state, which artist gets exhibited at the Pompidou is decided by French museums and things like that. And I wonder if we could have more of a sort of colonial and post-colonial conversation if we think beyond legality, is this acquired legally or not?
J'ai besoin d'aide pour la traduction. Je n'ai pas compris la question.
Donc, c'était cette question de légalité.
Oui.
Quand on a un cadre juridique pour penser ces questions. Et donc, qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire pour aller au-delà? Est-ce qu'il est possible même, dans le contexte français, d'aller au-delà de ce cadre juridique, d'imaginer ce qu'on peut faire?
D'acquisition légale ou pas légale?
Oui, c'est ça.
Il faut penser au problème de pouvoir en fait qu'il y a dans l'espace colonial et encore dans l'espace postcolonial au niveau du capital culturel qu'a la France, qui peut acheter des artistes, qui décide quel artiste africain va percer et qui va pas percer. Enfin bref, voilà.
Voilà, merci beaucoup.
Alors. C'est un peu l'histoire des musées et de l'histoire de l'art et du regard que vous posez au-delà de la question de l'Afrique et de de l'histoire coloniale. C'est la toute-puissance ou peut-être la puissance tout simplement que peut avoir un œil, quelqu'un qui va mettre en avant tel ou tel artiste. Alors, ça peut être un conservateur, ça peut être un critique d'art. Je pense à Apollinaire, par exemple, pour l'art africain. Il a été déterminant. Mais bon, dans tous les domaines, même des artistes qui vont être en contestation, comme ça a été le cas pour l'art moderne, avec des gens comme Matisse ou d'autres artistes qui étaient dans le Salon des refusés, dont personne, qu'on critiquait et qu'on ne voulait pas voir, et qui sont finalement, par leur mode de contestation, ont émergé et sont devenus les avant-gardes qu'on connaît. Donc là, c'est un peu compliqué, mais c'est vrai que il y a c'est la puissance de la forme, ce dont je parlais un petit peu en conclusion, c'est-à-dire qu'il y a, malgré, c'est important, moi je pense qu'on doit de plus en plus connaître cette histoire et éventuellement cette histoire sanglante qu'il peut y avoir derrière les objets, ou d'histoires très sans problème, mais c'est important de connaître ces histoires, mais il y a quand même... En premier, il y a une force que peuvent dégager les objets qui sont transnationaux en fait, qui vont dépasser les frontières ou même la compréhension de l'usage initial de l'objet. Donc, dans l'art contemporain, on peut ressentir aussi cette force, et après, c'est pour nous, dans les musées, c'est le travail des conservateurs de repérer aussi certains artistes qui ont cette puissance qui va transporter le visiteur vers quelque chose qui est de l'ordre de l'émotion, mais aussi de la connaissance. Donc, voilà, je ne sais pas si j'ai répondu à la question.
Oui. Natasha, did you have something?
No, I thought that was a great question. I was sitting here wondering, is France post-colonial? Is it really, So, it's the legal context is also very strong in the United States too, and in the United States it's mostly international law actually, and then individual treaties possibly can come into play that the US has, but here it has not so much been about the law. Navigating the law is a process, but the debate has really been around doing the right thing.
Yes, and we are at time, alas, but, Jennifer, you have a second? I don't know if, we're at time, alas, but that's, yeah. Thank you all.